Hello everyone, and a very big warm welcome to our co-hosted webinar all around the new Fertiliser Protection Regulations, or FPR as it will be referred to throughout. So just to get a few formalities out of the way first, we are recording today's session. Hopefully you've all seen the little recording in the top of your screens. We may share the event on our social media platforms and we will share it with anyone who's registered. Details of the registrants are retained under our GDPR policies, so please don't worry about us sharing your details anywhere that they shouldn't be. It will purely just be retained within the two companies that are hosting today's events. On registration, you were provided the opportunity to send any questions you may have in advance of today's session. We'll answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentations. If you do have any questions that pop up at all during the session, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer all of them. So, it is lovely to see so many of you take their time to attend today. My name is Sherry White and I run Oxford Analytical Services Limited. We are an independent CRO based in Oxfordshire and we've been operating since 1989. We primarily carry out testing such as storage stability, 5-batch analysis to support global registration for plant protection products, biocides, biostimulants, and we also work on various novel projects to support various chemistry challenges that our customers might be facing. We also do routine testing such as that required for the fertilizers. So the fertilizer regulations are very relevant to the industries that we already support, and we're quite happy to be able to offer analytical services to support them further. You can get in touch with us via our website or by email to inquiries@oxford-analytical.co.uk. And that's my little sales pitch over for the minute. We also have the pleasure of partnering today with Barkwith Associates, whom I've known for many, many years. Barkwith Associates are an independent consultancy who work closely with testing houses to provide a complete service for their clients. They provide expert advice and regulatory support to clients both large and small. Now celebrating their 20th anniversary year, Barkwith are proud to add EU FPR compliance to their fertiliser services to complement both EC fertiliser declaration and national regulations. Their portfolio also includes strategy support, dossier preparation, and authority representation for plant protection, biocides, REACH CLP, both in GB and EU. They can be contacted via their website, LinkedIn, or email info@barkwithassociates.com. So, without further delay, please let me introduce our first speaker of today to you, the fabulous Mr. Murray Smedley, who is the founder and managing director of Barkwith Associates. After a variety of technical positions in industry, he formed the business in 2002 with a desire to provide clear, concise and pragmatic advice. Murray is active in a variety of industry associations covering the range of services Barkwith provides. His work within the European Biostimulant Industry Council and CEM working groups continue to provide advice to the Commission and the development documents to support the FPR. Murray will be covering our first topic of today, FPR Purpose and Principles. Over to you, Murray.
Hello and welcome to the first presentation of the webinar today regarding the fertilising products regulation. My talk is going to discuss and summarise briefly the purpose and principles of Regulation 2019-1009. Within that, I'm going to brief you over the background, i.e. the previous regulation, the previous control, and where the ideas for the FPR were derived from. I'll also briefly mention the scope of the FPR, the principles of it, and also a few points on the structure of the FPR dossier and how one might consider compliance. And thereafter, the second presentation will specifically talk about a product function category, PFC1, which concerns itself with traditional fertilisers. So first off, on the background to the FPR, the previous EU regulation 2003 has been used, as we would see there, for many years, but it had many deficiencies that the EU considered and wished to improve upon. Firstly, there was a very limited number of source fertilising materials that could be considered to be suitable to comply with 2003. These really concern themselves mainly with traditional mined and virgin mineral materials, and because of that there was a wide and increasing number of substances and components that are now used for fertilising of food crops that weren't considered previously in the older regulation. There was also no recognition particularly or definition of products providing non-nutritional effects. So basically for those products that we see are used, a good example might be biostimulants, where we're not actually adding there is no direct traditional nutritional composition of those materials. They do add to the ability of the plant to overcome abiotic stressors and to increase the nutritional uptake and indeed perhaps composition of the crop. There was also minimal testing and traceability requirements under the previous regulation, and local, national, member state laws were routinely applied to fertilising products that fell outside of 2003. We see these regulations, national laws, being very variable in their complexity and their detail. So there was certainly very limited harmonisation between the requirements to place on the market non-traditional fertilising products within the previous regulation. The FPR, as the Fertilising Products Regulation is known as, came into force on the 16th of July 2022 after some 6 or 7 years of consultation and many hours of industry involvement from all sides to make sure it encompassed all of the components that the Commission wanted to see in a new all-encompassing fertiliser regulation. DEFRA, who is responsible for the control of fertilisers in the UK, in the GB, currently maintains the previous EC fertiliser declaration. It is considering whether to adopt the FPR, but for the time being, at least for products sold placed on the GB market, compliance with the previous EC fertiliser declaration is all that is required. So national rules no longer apply in member states to products that were previously controlled under 2003. They are primarily those in a category called PFC1. We'll discuss those in greater detail in the next presentation. But national rules can be applied for products falling outside of the previous regulation, where member states still have their own national rules in place. Some member states do, some member states don't. Importantly also, for those placing products on the market, that upon entry into force, as I say, July the 16th of this year, the only allowance for products already on the for products being placed on the market was that they were able to. There is a sell-through period of existing packaged stock. All newly packaged fertilising products placed on the market after the date of entry have to comply with the FPR. So my next slide concerns really the scope of the FPR. So this really looks at what the FPR's intentions for, what are the intentions of what are the intentions of the FPR. So the Commission looked and wanted to devise a regulation that opens a single market for fertilising products that are not currently covered by a harmonised regulation. So this, as we mentioned in the previous slide, there's a variety of national rules and national laws that that weren't covered by the regulation, and this includes substances and products such as organo and organo-mineral fertilisers, soil improvers, inhibitors, plant biostimulants, growing media or blends. The FPR also introduces a wider range of limits for toxic contaminants, and the regulation as a whole, just as a note, is designed to is applied to the design, manufacture and placing on the market of fertilising products. It does not apply to the use or mode of action for fertilising products, certainly not for the more traditional fertilising products, which we will be discussing, as I mentioned, in the next presentation. Member states that have their own national rules still in place with regard to fertilising products that aren't covered by this traditional category can still, if they so wish, use the mutual recognition regulation to adopt approvals for placing on the market for other non-traditional fertilisers when they've having been evaluated by a second member state. So our next slide concerns the principles of the FPR. So in terms of what it's designed to do and how it works, the FPR provides an expanded range and definition of types of fertilising products. So rather than the very restrictive and traditional list we saw under 2003, we have many more types of components that can be considered, are now considered rather, to be used within fertilising products. So it has an expanded range and definition of these components, which we'll move on to in some of the slides shortly. The FPR, for the first time under EU regulation, also defines abiotic stress and nutrient use efficiency. The principle of these here is that these are widely used to prove a beneficial effect for biostimulant products. So those are materials where we're not adding to the base nutrition to the crop directly, but more we are enhancing the crop's ability to uptake and use those nutritional materials that we may apply or may already be in the soil. The FPR also provides a clearer legal definition of borderline plant protection product scope. So effectively, anything that isn't a plant protection product or considered under would be considered under the FPR. So it is more designed to be a control of inputs and materials applied into the food chain. The FPR also allows for greater control within maximum residue limits. So there's various regulations that concern themselves with MRLs into the food chain, such as pesticide product regulations, veterinary medicines and pharmaceuticals. And last but by no means least, the FPR provides the regulators with a greater control and compliance check that those substances being applied to the crop and as such being declared under the FPR comply within the EU REACH regulation. So the structure of the FPR dossier. So firstly, we see there is two key elements to the structure of the dossier. The first one is the categorisation of the product function. So we see there is 7 product function categories, PFCs as they're called, and your fertilising product must fit within one of those 7 categories. And the second key element to the structure of the dossier is the component material categories. So we see there is 11 CMCs as they're defined as, and they basically mean, and that basically determines within that what that basically determines each of your components within your fertilising product must be defined to be within one of the 11 CMCs. So to summarise that then, once you have identified the relevant product function category, so the relevant categorisation of the fertilising product itself, and then you've also assessed each of your components and fitted them into one of the 11 CMCs, you will then be required to, you can then proceed to look at conducting and considering the conformity assessment procedure. So I'm now going to briefly mention the 7 product function categories. We have them on this table here, but I've got them on the slide also. I won't dwell too much on them, as today's presentations are concerning themselves with PFC 1s primarily, and what we consider to be the more traditional fertilisers. So PFC 1, as I mentioned earlier, inorganic, organomineral and organic fertilisers, and as I say, we'll go into greater detail on that particular product function category in the next presentation. Product function category 2 concerns itself with soil improvers. Product function category 3 with liming materials. 4 with growing media, 5 with inhibitors such as nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors. Product function category 6, biostimulants. As I mentioned, this is where the abiotic stressors and nutrient use efficiency descriptions and the uses might fall under. Product function category 7, the final one is fertilising product blends. That is principally put in there to allow the inclusion of one or more of the product function categories within the product you are placing on the market. So our next slide is a brief summary of the component material categories, and as I mentioned earlier, all of your components must be defined within one of the product function, well, one of the component material categories, and I've briefly summarised them here. So CMC1 is virgin material substances and mixtures, such as minerals. CMC2 plant parts of plant extracts. So here we might concern ourselves with things like molasses and seaweed extracts. CMC3 is composts. It's pretty self-explanatory. CMC4 is fresh crop digestates. CMC5 is digestate that aren't from other than fresh crop digestates. CMC6 is food industry byproducts. 7 is microorganisms, where there is currently a very prescriptive list, a very limited list of microorganisms that can be included in the FPR, although there is discussions within industry and the Commission to expand upon that. CMC8 is nutrient polymers, so those that do have a nutrient effect, and CMC9 is polymers other than those, so that would be excuse me, polymers concerned with control release in terms of perhaps control breakdown or water absorption within the fertilising product when it's placed into the soil or the growing media. CMC10 is subcomponents derived from the and allowed within the animal byproducts regulation. And CMC11 is similarly components derived from and allowed within the other waste products regulation. So the conformity assessments, how are these defined? How are these taken? How are these conducted? The conformity assessment is divided into 4 modules. Once you have determined the modules which apply to your product, you can then determine the type of assessment and declaration that is required. So module A is an internal production control. This is a self-declaration, and this refers very much to the product function category 1 that we'll discuss shortly. Module B is an EU type examination, so this is the process where you must send your dossier, having compiled it, to a certified body, and they will then assess your data independently and then declare that if they feel they have sufficient information to certify it. Module C is a conformity assessment to type based on internal production control. So this is really an additional component for quality control and production control from the assessment that you must send into your certified body. And module D1 is a quality assurance process for the self-declaration system. So this is really the quality assurance to prove your product is made consistently and there is some declaration and some standardization within your manufacturing process. Summarize this here in a large table, which large matrix which outlines the product function categories 1 to 7, the component materials 1 to 11, and then within this matrix it shows you the modules that you need to comply with. That summarizes my presentation on an outline of the product of the fertilising products with regulation. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laurie. That was incredibly insightful, and hopefully it's given people a good understanding of what the FPR rule is all about and why it's so significant. So our next speaker for today is Ashleigh Chappell, who is a consultant at Barkwith Associates. Ashleigh's key area of work over the last 12 months has been in developing Barkwith's approach to FPR and compliance for their client database. Ashleigh leads the preparation of technical dossiers and client liaison and has successfully completed many PFC1 conformity assessments. Ashleigh will be covering our second part for today, product function category 1, general requirements for self-declaration, certification and CE marking. Over to you, Ashleigh.
So I'll be talking about product function category 1 and the general requirements for self-declaration and CE marking. So firstly, focusing on the background of the FPR, is comprised of two categories, product function categories and component material categories. For product function categories, this relates to the function of the fertilizing product, with there being 7 categories to choose from. There are fertilizers, soil improvers, liming materials, growing mediums, inhibitors, plant biostimulants, and fertilizing product blends. These categories are then further split into subcategories such as inorganic, organomineral, and organic fertilizers, and microbial and non-microbial biostimulants. Each category and subcategory have their own requirements for things such as contaminant limits, nutrient content, and pathogen limits. Your fertilizing product must fit into and meet the requirements of at least one of these categories, and today we're going to focus on PFC 1. For product function category 1, the function of the fertilizing product should be to provide nutrients to plants or mushrooms. PFC 1 is split into 3 categories: inorganic fertilizers, organomineral fertilizers, and organic fertilizers. These are then further divided into solid and liquid products, and macronutrients and micronutrients for inorganic fertilizers. This PFC covers the large majority of fertilizing products that are being put on the market. Looking at organic fertilizers, these need to contain organic carbon and nutrients of solely biological origin. They cannot contain material which is fossilized or embedded in geological formations. The content of organic carbon needs to be at least 50% in a solid fertilizer and 5% in a liquid fertilizer. Organic fertilizers have limits on contaminants for cadmium, hexavalent chromium, mercury, nickel, lead, and inorganic arsenic. Biuret cannot be present at all. There are also limits for microorganisms that may be in the fertilizers, such as Salmonella and E. coli. For organomineral fertilizers, they must be a co-formulation of one or more inorganic fertilizers and are one or more materials containing organic carbon and nutrients of solely biological origin. This is effectively a mixture between PFC-1C and PFC-1A. The content of organic carbon needs to be at least 8% in a solid fertilizer and 3% in a liquid fertilizer. Organomineral fertilizers also have limits of contaminants and microorganisms similar to organic fertilizers. Inorganic fertilizers are fertilizers that contain or release nutrients in a mineral form. It is divided into categories for solid and liquid products, as well as macronutrients and micronutrients. It is then further divided into straight fertilizers and compound fertilizers. For straight fertilizers, these contain either only one primary macronutrient, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or one macronutrient and secondary macronutrients, such as calcium, magnesium, sodium, or sulfur. A compound fertilizer will contain more than one primary macronutrient or more than one secondary macronutrient. For solid fertilizers, the minimum nutrient content required is 18% by mass, and the minimum nutrient content decreases to 7% for liquid fertilizers. There are also contaminant limits in place for cadmium, hexavalent chromium, mercury, nickel, lead, inorganic arsenic, and biuret. So depending on which PFC and CMC category your product is, it corresponds to a specific conformity assessment procedure that must be followed for the EU Declaration of Conformity. There are 4 different conformity assessments, Module A, B, C, and D, with the 2 most common being Module A and B. The majority of PFC-1 products will fall into the Module A category. Module A is a self-assessment procedure, when the manufacturer or representative completes the technical document, drafts the EU Declaration of Conformity, and adds the CE marking to the label of your product. This then allows the product to be sold freely within the EU market. Focusing on the technical documentation, this is a dossier of information and documents that are required for the EU Declaration of Conformity. This will cover the design, manufacture, and use of the fertilizing product, as well as any test reports. In Module A, B, C, and D, this is the manufacturer's responsibility to complete and keep on file. This table shows us the information which is required for each module. As you can see, there are many things which are required for all modules, such as the PFC, use, component materials, and manufacturing process. For the purpose of this training, we will be focusing on Module A. A list of all component materials and their content is required, as well as a designation of a component material category for each. The origin of the materials is also needed, with a description of the manufacturing process if it is available. Drawing, schemes, or a description of the manufacturing process for the finished product is also required. A specimen label for the fertilizing product should also be included, showing the CE mark and labelling requirements. A list of harmonised standards which have been followed are also needed, which would include REACH registrations, poison centre notifications, or any CEN standards that have been followed for any testing carried out. If any component materials have maximum residue limits, these will need to be shown with calculations indicating that these have been conformed to. Calculations or test reports that indicate the total amount of chromium in the finished product are also needed. If the total amount is above 200 mg per kilogram, the source of the chromium will be needed and the maximum quantity needs to be stated. For other test reports, this will need to include testing for impurities that were mentioned previously. As well as this, a standard certificate of analysis should be included, showing nutrient content for the finished products. Any SOPs or laboratory accreditation can be included here to indicate how the testing was carried out. The labelling requirements of fertilisers are quite straightforward and similar to the previous EC labels. The content of each primary macronutrient and secondary macronutrient is required on the label, as well as any micronutrients. A list of ingredients is also required on the label, showing only the component materials that are included above 5%. These are shown in descending order, with the ingredient with the highest content shown first. The CAS number for each of these should be also shown on the label, along with the CMC category of each ingredient. This is an example of what FPR compliant label looks like. The CE marking is at the top with the product function category and each nutrient and its content declared underneath. The list of ingredients are displayed at the bottom with the CAS number and relevant CMC categories also shown. Moving on to required testing, there are limits within the FPR for heavy metals, as mentioned before. This requires specific testing to ensure compliance is met for the contaminants, and these should be completed with standardised or recognised methods. Testing is required for cadmium, hexavalent chromium, mercury, nickel, lead, inorganic arsenic, and biuret. Some of these tests can be omitted, however, if it's determined that these products are unlikely to contain these due to the component materials. GLP facilities are not required for this testing, but they are helpful, especially if certification from a notifying body is necessary in Module B. Oxford Analytical will now take over and talk further about the testing requirements.
Thank you very much, Ashleigh. That gave us a really good detail and insight into the regulations a bit further. Just a reminder to all of our attendees, if you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat and we will cover them at the end of the sessions. So I now have the pleasure to introduce to you Graham White. Our more senior attendees may know Graham from his time as owner of GC Laboratories Limited before its successful sale and his retirement in 2010. He now supports us at Oxford Analytical as a chemistry consultant and will be covering our next topic, chemistry requirements and potential waivers. Over to you, Graham.
Hello everybody, my name's Graham White. I've been involved in chemical analysis and also chemical physical testing for over 50 years now. I know I don't look that old. Anyway, I was previously managing director and owner of a company called GC Laboratories, and I'm now working as a consultant since my retirement. I'm now working as a consultant for Oxford Analytical. I hope this presentation doesn't bore you too much, and I can hopefully give you a little bit of insight in what we can do. On this slide I have a table which shows the limits that have been set for a number of possible contaminants in various types of fertiliser. My part of the presentation is going to concentrate on biuret and perchlorate and the phosphonates. It should be noted really that biuret is only present in fertilisers containing urea and therefore can be ignored in all other fertiliser products. In a similar manner, perchlorate is only possible, or only really possible, contaminant in fertilisers containing sodium nitrate. On the other hand, phosphonates are only present due to accidental or intentional addition. The most common form of nitrogen fertiliser worldwide is based on urea. Although it's naturally occurring, it can be manufactured by reacting carbon dioxide with ammonia at high temperature and pressure. When urea is heated up to near or about its melting point of 132 degrees C during its manufacture, several different compounds can be formed as shown in the diagram on the left. The one of most concern to us is biuret. Although manufacturing processes in modern days produce very low levels of biuret, it is still of concern. I have shown the biuret molecule here. It's a very naughty little molecule, and plants are very slow at metabolizing it. It can remain present in foliage and other plant material for several months following its application. When it's applied to soil, it affects the rate of microbial growth and decreases the rate of nitrification. If it is placed close to the seeds, toxicity may affect the plant as it germinates. Foliar applied biuret can lead to severe leaf damage in some plants, much more so than when it's applied to the soil. Therefore, the presence of even very low levels present in spray should be avoided. The picture added here shows leaf damage caused by biuret to citrus leaves. Perchlorates are soluble in water and generally have high mobility in soils. This characteristic results in their ability to move from soil surfaces into groundwater. Perchlorates are ionic substances and therefore do not volatilise from water or soil surfaces. Perchlorates are very persistent in the environment and at high concentrations can affect the thyroid gland by inhibiting the uptake of iodine. This may lead to tumours of the thyroid gland. Some plants, especially leafy green vegetables, have been found to have elevated levels of perchlorate. When water containing perchlorate is used to irrigate the plants, perchlorate is left behind when water evaporates from the leaves of the plants. Studies do not record any toxic effects to the actual plants. Although plants may not be affected by perchlorate toxicity, plant uptake provides a point of entry into the food chain for herbivorous animals. The source of perchlorates found in fertiliser is predominantly due to naturally occurring perchlorate found in deposits of sodium nitrate. Although sodium nitrate can be manufactured these days, it's still mined as a source for some nitrate-based fertilisers. Just off the subject slightly, I once had a lad come to an interview with me, and when I asked him what is nitrate, he says probably double time. The regulations state that phosphorus cannot be used by the plant as a nutrient source of phosphorus. In addition, the plant cannot oxidise phosphonate into phosphate. Therefore, phosphonate cannot be considered a nutrient and cannot fall under the regulations. So the presence of any phosphonate in a fertiliser can only be present there due to accidental or deliberate addition. Potassium and magnesium phosphonates have been added to leaf fertilisers to help prevent magnesium and potassium deficiency. The picture on the slide shows potassium deficiency in oilseed rape. It should be noted that phosphonates also can act as fungicides and could be another reason for their addition. The application of phosphonate products may lead to residues of phosphonic acid in the plants and fruits. As these same residues are found after application of, for example, phosphatile aluminium, they add further to the amount of phosphonic acid, which then could exceed the MRLs. Bioret in urea-based fertilisers can be determined by reverse phase HPLC, in this case employing an amino or amino propyl column with either UV or mass spec detection. Chlorate and phosphonates can be determined by ion chromatography. In each case, employing a suitable ion column. Detection of the eluted species can be performed employing either a conductivity detector or a mass spec detector, or with ion pairing a UV detector. Analytical methods will be tailor-made to suit a particular fertiliser type. Oxford Analytical have state-of-the-art equipment and well-trained staff with a wealth of knowledge in development and validation of analytical methods. Methods developed for any of the fertiliser products will be checked for its robustness and repeatability. Validation will cover specificity, linearity, accuracy, precision and range. LOD and LOQ may be required dependent on the levels we are looking at. LOD means limit of detection, and that is the very, very lowest limit that an analyte can be detected at. LOQ stands for limit of quantification, and that is the lowest limit that an analyte can be quantified at. The diagram shows the difference between precision and accuracy. There are two distinct things. Often comes down to combined trueness, really, of results. Thank you, everybody. That's my lot done for the day. I hope it wasn't too onerous, and we hope to hear from you soon. Bye-bye for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. That gives a bit of chemistry insight into why these regulations exist. So without further delay, I will now introduce our final speaker for today, Dr. Louise Hare. Louise has worked for Oxford Analytical for around 18 months now and has an extensive amount of knowledge when it comes to inorganic chemistry. Louise looks after all of our equipment and carries out GLP studies as a study director, but her expertise lies with ICP applications, and she's transformed our services in this area with our ICP, OES, MS, and newly introduced HPLC ICPMS to be able to offer the speciation services needed under the FPR. Louise will explain the elemental analysis aspects further in her section, Why is elemental analysis so significant? Over to you, Louise.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Sherry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Louise from Oxford Analytical Services, and I'm going to be presenting on why elemental analysis is so significant and relating this back to the recent changes in fertiliser regulations. I'm just going to start off by giving a quick reminder as to the elements which are required to be tested from the fertiliser regulations, and these include cadmium, mercury, nickel, lead, copper and zinc, as well as speciation analysis of hexavalent chromium and inorganic arsenic. Limits for these heavy metals have been introduced to fertiliser regulations as they are all toxic to the environment and human health at certain concentrations. A variety of mechanisms are at play for all elements, and this diagram gives an overview of the complexity of the different mechanisms involved in toxicity. I'm not going to go into details in this diagram, but I just wanted to show how complex the toxicity of heavy metals is. To make things more complicated, some of these elements, such as copper, zinc and chromium, are essential trace elements, which means they're required for human health, but they're also toxic at high levels, which is illustrated by this diagram here. As you can see, that the majority of the testing required is for total element composition. However, for chromium and arsenic, we're only interested in a certain species, and I will elaborate on why this is the case for each element. The toxicity of an element is influenced by its solubility and therefore mobility, which determines how bioavailable it is. This basically means how readily absorbed an element is into the human body. Chromium-6, which is also known as hexavalent chromium, is soluble across a range of pHs, and therefore it's mobile enough to enter the human body and cause problems. Hexavalent chromium also has a similar chemistry to sulfate, which allows for it to go through the same channels and be uptaken into plants. On the other hand, chromium-3, or trivalent chromium, is very, very insoluble and therefore not readily absorbed by the body, meaning it has a much lower toxicity, and it is also an essential trace element to human health. Chromium is an excellent example of where the solubility and mobilization, and therefore subsequent ability of a compound to enter into the body, determines the toxicity of a compound. However, mobility does not always determine toxicity. Arsenic is a very good example of an element where mobility does not determine toxicity. Arsenic is present in the environment in a variety of different species, including inorganic compounds, arsenate and arsenite. And the most common organic compounds are methylated forms of arsenate and arsenite, such as arsenobutane, monomethyl arsenic acid, and dimethyl arsenic acid. All of these compounds are readily absorbed into the body, and therefore their toxicity is down to the interactions of the individual compound in the body. Research has identified inorganic arsenic as the most toxic form of arsenic. However, recent studies have suggested that MMA and DMA also have a degree of toxicity. On the other hand, arsenobutane is completely non-toxic. After learning of the differences in species for chromium and arsenic, I hope it's easy to see why speciation analysis is required. But just to cement the point, I've thrown together a hypothetical example. Here we can see a graph of total arsenic concentrations for some common foods which do contain arsenic. So we have rice, seaweed, marine fish and shellfish. From this graph, with the total arsenic concentrations all being the same, it might suggest that they've got the same degree of toxicity. However, breaking this down into the arsenic species, we can see that rice contains the largest proportion of inorganic arsenic, which is the big green bars at the bottom, and this is making up about 75% of the total arsenic. Seaweed has the largest proportion of arsenolipids, which have very low toxicity, and a little bit of inorganic arsenic, whereas marine fish and shellfish are largely made up of arsenobutane, which, as I said earlier, are completely non-toxic, showing that why speciation analysis is so essential. Relating this back to the fertiliser regulations, the limit for hexavalent chromium is 2 milligrams per kilogram. So if we were to analyse for total chromium, and this was less than 2 milligrams per kilogram, there'd be no need to test for hexavalent chromium because we know that the hexavalent chromium concentration can't be more than the total concentration of chromium. However, if the total chromium concentration was greater than 2 milligrams per kilogram, this would necessitate the analysis for hexavalent chromium to ensure that the concentration of hexavalent chromium is not beyond 2 milligrams per kilogram. Going back to all the metals in the regulations, I just want to give a brief overview of the different instrumentation we would use for the different elements and speciation. For total element concentrations, we have two pieces of kit, and which one we would use depends on the maximum allowable level. Both of these are inductively coupled plasmas, which is a sample introduction system which ionizes the sample. ICP-OES is optical emission spectrometry, where it measures a wavelength of light which is characteristic to the chemical element and can give limits of detections in parts per million and high parts per billion. And this would be what our choice to analyse the elements nickel, lead, total arsenic, copper and zinc, as they all have quite high maximum allowable levels from the regulations. Our other kit we would use is an ICP-MS, which is mass spectrometry, and this measures the mass charge ratio of an element and gives LO limits of detections of low parts per billion and parts per trillion. This is what we would use to measure total mercury and cadmium, whereas we also need to use the ICP-MS for the speciation analysis. And how do we do this? Coupling HPLC, which is high performance liquid chromatography, to ICP-MS, we're able to separate the different arsenic and chromium compounds, which would then lead us to be able to perform quantitative speciation analysis for your regulatory requirements. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening, and if you have any chemistry or regulatory challenges that you're facing, not just linked to heavy metals and speciation analysis, please let us know, because I think we might be able to help. Thank you again.
Okay, lovely. That concludes our presentations for today. So we have had a few questions come through on the chat, so I shall just read those out and ask for volunteers from our panel to answer them. So our first question is, who do we have to send our self-declaration FPR dossier to? Ashleigh?
Yeah, so for a self-declaration of conformity, you don't have to send that to anyone. It's just a self-assessment. You do the dossier yourself, the EU declaration of conformity yourself. There's no third party that has to assess it. You just have to keep the documentation on file once you've completed it all yourself.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So our next question, I've heard the requirements for biostimulants are unclear. Is the Commission planning to clarify or amend any of the requirements?
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah. So yeah, the requirements biostimulants are quite vague. In fact, the requirements for anything other than traditional fertilizers under the FPR are quite vague. There is quite a lot of discussion at the moment about how they can be clear, and some guidance notes are being prepared. I'm aware that some notifying bodies are already assessing biostimulants, but I'm also wary of the fact they are quite concerned about how one might define and justify the claims. So a little bit challenging, and certainly we'd be very happy to help anyone that has that query on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you, Murray. So next question, our customers have asked if they can self-declare. Should I agree to this? That one for Ashleigh?
Yeah, so for this, we would obviously recommend doing the dossiers yourself, because the dossiers contain a lot of confidential information that you wouldn't necessarily want to give to your customers, like formulation details, manufacturer details. And it also is the manufacturer's responsibility to fill in the dossier. The only thing that you do have to provide to the customers is the EU Declaration of Conformity certificate.
Okay, thank you, Ashleigh. So next question, I have a CMC that does not fit within the 11 of the FPR. What can I do? Murray, I think that's one for you.
Okay, Sherry, yeah, thank you. Yeah, there is, again, part of the discussion with industry associations is that there is an opportunity, or the Commission is open to adding new CMCs. The regulation is very broad is a very broad sweep, but obviously as it was prepared by the authorities, they don't have the knowledge of the market as expected that obviously the players in that do. So certainly have a conversation with one of the notified bodies, or indeed go to your national or indeed go to your national authority, who can certainly give you some advice. But there is certainly opportunity for the FPR to expand the number of CMCs.
Okay, thank you. So we have also got, you mentioned possible waivers. What sort of waivers could you provide? I think that might be one for Graham.
Yeah. Can you really everything would sort of need testing in the start of the process. But if manufacturers can claim that they are getting their product, their raw material from the same source over and over again, then there is a possible waiver there that we wouldn't have to analyse over. You could continually analyse in the same product a number of times, but obviously that there are fertilizers do not contain urea, obviously won't contain bioret, so that's straight away knocked on the head. So we wouldn't have to look for bioret in fertilizers that don't contain urea, obviously. But really, it should be by case before we can actually state that that there is a waiver.
Okay, thank you. Next question, I think Louise, this one might be aimed at you. Where might we find these impurities come from?
Thanks, Sherry. So again, like Graham said, this is probably on a case-by-case basis, but potential places they could come from would be feedstocks that are being used to produce the end fertilizer product, and depending on the manufacturing processes, metals such as chromium coming from chromium stainless steel, zinc and copper coming from different alloys in the production process might potentially be a source of contamination in the final product. But again, it would need to be investigated.
Okay, thank you. So another one here we've got, does the FPR only apply to substances applied to food crops? Would fertilizing products applied to tree growing be included? Perhaps Murray or Ashleigh, is that one for you?
I can go share who. Yes, so the FPR it's sort of derived around the issue of applying substances to food crops, but it does apply to all crops. So yeah, so any nutritional material you apply to any plant. So yes, unfortunately, non-food crops, it's very difficult to define that. The FPR also doesn't give a lot of detail in certainly PFC 1 as to which crops there is no requirement to prove an effectiveness, certainly for PFC 1. So on that basis, the person using the fertilizer could apply it to food crops, even if that was not the intention. So it does unfortunately apply.
Okay. So I think this is our, oh, we might have one more. I've got another one here. So the question relates to a blend product. PFC 1 and PFC 6, macronutrients plus plant biostimulants with CMC 1 components. A conformity assessment module A and B can be conducted. How does this work exactly? Is the blended product evaluated by the conformity body, or the manufacturer should provide only the required documents or test materials relevant to the plant biostimulant part? That is in the chat if you need to reread it, Murray.
Okay, so yeah, that is quite a challenging one, sent in by one of the listeners in that I know this morning. That is difficult. We've taken the approach certainly for sort of PFC 1, where we are looking at the traditional fertilizers. If the biostimulant material, if there is no claims made on the purpose or the efficacy of the material, the product being affected by a biostimulant component, we would be quite happy to put it into PFC 1 and be able to self-certify. If you're making claims that the product or the biostimulant material has a defined and recognizable value, then that would need to be assessed, I believe, by a notified body. If I pass that on to Ashleigh, if I may, she may be able to add a little more.
Yes, so if it's a PFC 7, a blend product, and it's got a PFC 1 and a PFC 6 component in it, there'd need to be 2 different conformity assessments. So the PFC 1 would be a self-assessment, you would do the dossier yourself, and then the PFC 6 is the product that would be sent to the conformity body with the technical documentation for that. And then for the PFC 7, it's effectively just putting those 2 dossiers together to make the blend products.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is our final question. Will they need poison centre notification through IUCLID, and would they need a UFI?
Thanks, Joe. Yes, indeed. The poison centre notification is an entirely different process and unconnected to FPR. So if your product has human health hazards and is being placed on the market, whatever market that is, in the EU, of course, not in the GB, then yes, you would need to submit your poison centre notification and include the unique formulation identifier on the label itself. And just for those people that are listening in today that are based in GB, obviously to submit poison centre notification, you have to have an EU entity address or use an only representative.
Okay, lovely. Well, I think that's it. There's nothing else coming through on the chat. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all again so much for attending. We really do appreciate your time, and hopefully we've been helpful. So if there's no further questions, we'll wrap up. And just please remember, if there's anything else you wanted to ask after today, you can get in touch with either of us, info@barkwithassociates.com or inquiries@oxford-analytical.co.uk. Thank you very much, everyone.